The late afternoon sun of a Tuesday in June, 1978, pushed long, golden fingers across the worn linoleum of the Finch family kitchen. Dust motes, caught in the light, danced a slow, aimless ballet above the chipped formica table where 9-year-old Sarah sat, her small brow furrowed in intense concentration. Eleanor, at the sink, moved with the quiet efficiency of long habit, rinsing lettuce leaves under a cool stream from the tap. The radio, perched precariously on the windowsill, hummed a pop song about summer love and fleeting goodbyes, its melody a gentle counterpoint to the domestic sounds of running water and the faint scratching of Sarah's pencil. Sarah, utterly absorbed, meticulously rendered a fantastical beast onto her drawing pad. It had far too many wings, each feathered with intricate detail, and not nearly enough legs, a charming anatomical impossibility that only a child could envision. Her tongue, a tiny pink flag of focus, was caught between her teeth. She hummed a wordless tune, entirely unaware of the subtle shift in the air, the faint, almost imperceptible tightening in her mother's shoulders. Arthur, her father, was due home any minute from the timber yard. Eleanor could almost smell him already, the comforting, familiar scent of pine and sawdust that clung to his clothes, his hair, his very skin. Lately, though, there had been something else, a different undertone to his presence, something metallic and distant, like the faint tang of old iron or a forgotten rain. It was a scent that spoke not of the fresh, living wood he shaped, but of a quiet desperation that seemed to settle on him like a fine, persistent powder, impossible to brush away. When the back door finally clicked open, it wasn't the usual hearty scrape of his work boots against the mat. Instead, a more hesitant sound, a dragging weight. The scent of pine was there, yes, but that metallic tang felt sharper tonight. Arthur didn't offer his usual tired smile, the one that crinkled the corners of his warm hazel eyes and made him look approachable, even after a long day. His eyes, tonight, were clouded, distant, as if looking through a pane of frosted glass. He nodded briefly to Eleanor, a movement so slight it barely disturbed the air, and then, almost as an afterthought, ruffled Sarah's hair. His fingers brushed her head, but his gaze remained unfocused, passing over her as if she were a piece of furniture. He didn't linger. He walked straight to the armchair by the window, the one where the springs were starting to give, protesting softly with a faint groan as he sank into it. He picked up the evening paper, a folded sheet of newsprint, but didn't unfold it. Instead, he simply stared at the headline, a bold black pronouncement about rising inflation and factory closures, his gaze fixed and unseeing. Eleanor watched him, her hands still submerged in the cool water, the lettuce forgotten for a moment. A familiar knot, small and hard, tightened in her stomach. She knew the signs. The economy was a heavy cloak draped over everyone in their town, a pervasive chill that seeped into homes and conversations. But Arthur, her Arthur, seemed to feel its weight more acutely than most. He was a craftsman, proud of his skill, his hands capable of turning raw timber into pieces of lasting beauty. Yet, the orders for bespoke furniture were dwindling, replaced by cheaper, mass-produced pieces from catalogs, items that lacked the soul and precision of his own work. He was a man out of time, perhaps, in a world that was increasingly valuing speed and cost over artistry. Supper was a quiet affair, punctuated only by Sarah's bright, eager chatter. She recounted the saga of her fantastical beast, detailing its imaginary adventures, and then moved on to a new girl at school with a laugh that tinkled like tiny bells. She tried, with the innocent persistence of childhood, to pull her father into her world, offering him glimpses of her day, her thoughts. Arthur, however, offered only monosyllabic responses, pushing around the peas on his plate with his fork, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the kitchen wall. Eleanor tried to steer the conversation, her voice gentle, asking about his day, about Mr. Henderson at the yard, trying to find a conversational foothold. Arthur merely grunted, a low, guttural sound, mentioning something about a shipment delay, a contract lost. The words hung in the air, heavy and thick, laden with unspoken worries that no one dared to name. Later, after Sarah was tucked into bed, dreaming of winged creatures and new friends, Eleanor found Arthur still in the armchair, the newspaper now folded neatly beside him, unread. The kitchen was quiet, save for the soft tick of the old wall clock. She sat on the edge of the armchair, the worn floral fabric giving slightly under her weight, and reached for his hand. His skin felt cool, distant, unresponsive beneath her touch. She squeezed gently, her thumb tracing the calloused lines on his palm, and asked him what was wrong, truly wrong. He just shook his head, a slow, weary movement, his gaze already out the window, lost in the deepening twilight. The last vestiges of the June day were fading, giving way to the soft, purpling hues of evening. He said he needed to clear his head, that he'd go for a walk. He often did. It was his way of wrestling with the unspoken, of finding a quiet corner in the world. Eleanor watched him go, the click of the back door echoing faintly in the quiet house, a prickle of unease brushing against her skin. She dismissed it, telling herself it was just the stress, the economic worry. He'd be back. He always was. The next morning dawned gray and damp, a stark contrast to the previous day's golden warmth. Eleanor woke to the unfamiliar silence of the house, a silence that pressed in on her, heavier than usual. She reached out, her hand finding only the cool, undisturbed sheet on Arthur's side of the bed. It was cold. He hadn't just gotten up early, he hadn't been there at all. Her heart gave a small, nervous flutter. She threw off the covers, her bare feet meeting the cool linoleum of the bedroom floor. She padded to the back door, her eyes scanning the familiar hooks and corners. His work boots were gone from beside the mat. His jacket, the old tweed one he wore every day, was missing from its hook. She walked into the bathroom, a faint, lingering scent of his aftershave hanging in the air, a ghost of his morning routine. A prickle of unease, sharper this time, traced its way up her spine, but she pushed it down, firmly. He must have gone for an early walk, she reasoned, perhaps to think, to get a head start on something at the yard, to chase away the heavy thoughts that had plagued him last night. She made Sarah's breakfast, toast and marmalade, the usual routine of fragile comfort against the growing quiet in the house. The silence that had fallen over the Finch household was not the comfortable quiet of an empty afternoon, but a strained, breathless hush. Eleanor moved through the small rooms like a ghost, her bare feet making no sound on the worn linoleum. Every door Arthur might have used stood ajar, every cupboard he might have opened remained undisturbed. His worn denim jacket still hung on the peg by the back door, a familiar shape that now seemed to mock her. She checked the shed again, though she knew he wasn't there, the scent of sawdust and old paint only deepening the hollow ache in her chest. Nothing. No one had seen him since yesterday. The air in the house seemed to thicken, pressing in on her, making it hard to breathe. She paced the living room, a frantic circuit from the cold fireplace to the bay window, her mind racing through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. An accident? A sudden, urgent call? He wouldn't just leave. He couldn't. The thought was a raw, visceral denial that vibrated through her bones. When Sarah came home from school, the familiar squeak of her trainers on the porch and the clatter of her backpack hitting the hall floor usually heralded a burst of cheerful chatter. But today, her usual bright greeting died on her lips as she stepped into the living room. Eleanor stood by the window, her back to the light, her shoulders hunched in a way Sarah had never seen. The room felt colder, the air heavy and still. Sarah's small smile faltered, her schoolbag sliding unnoticed to the floor with a soft thump. Eleanor turned slowly, her face pale and drawn, the skin around her eyes tight. She tried to sound normal, a bright, brittle tone she didn't recognize as her own. "Hello, love. You're home." Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the careful facade. She took a breath, trying again. "Daddy's gone on a trip. A sudden business trip. He'll be back soon." She even managed a tremulous smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Sarah, sensing the lie like a chill wind, didn't respond immediately. Her gaze drifted past her mother towards the empty space by the coat rack where Arthur's heavy work boots usually sat, scuffed and familiar. The space was bare. Then her eyes moved up to Eleanor's, which were brimming with unshed tears, reflecting the gray afternoon light. The carefully constructed lie shattered between them. The silence that followed was louder than any argument, a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over the small room, pressing down on both of them. Sarah simply nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, and then went to her room, leaving Eleanor alone with the crushing weight of her unspoken grief. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the house grew colder, Eleanor finally picked up the rotary phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the familiar emergency number, the plastic disc whirring slowly back into place after each digit. She waited, listening to the distant ring, a knot tightening in her stomach. A weary-sounding officer took down the details, his voice flat, devoid of any real concern. His tone suggested this was a common occurrence, not a desperate plea from a woman whose world had just imploded. "He's an adult, ma'am," he said, his voice crackling slightly through the receiver. "Free to go where he pleases. We'll put out a notice, of course, but—" He let the sentence hang, implying the futility of it all. The dismissal felt like a slap, a cold splash of reality. Eleanor hung up the phone, the receiver heavy in her hand, the quiet dread that had been gnawing at her now a crushing certainty. Arthur was gone. The simple finality of it resonated through the empty house. The days bled into weeks, each one stretching longer than the last. Eleanor, driven by a desperate, fading hope, plastered flyers with Arthur's photo on lampposts and shop windows. The grainy image, a slightly faded color snapshot from a family holiday, stared out with an almost accusatory sadness. His smile seemed forced, his eyes distant. Each time she smoothed one onto a damp brick wall, the cheap adhesive sticking to her fingers, she felt a fresh pang of despair. Passers-by would glance, some with pity, others with a quick, dismissive curiosity. She fielded calls from well-meaning neighbors, their voices a mixture of condolences and thinly veiled speculation. Mrs. Gable next door, her voice dripping with sympathy, suggested Arthur might have been under a bit of stress. Mr. Henderson, Arthur's old boss from the carpentry shop, called to offer a gruff, practical assessment of Arthur's work ethic, which did little to soothe Eleanor's raw nerves. Each call was a fresh stab, a reminder of the public nature of her private agony. She found herself offering clipped, polite answers, wanting only to hang up, to retreat into the silence that was now her constant companion. Sarah, initially confused by her father's absence, grew quiet. She stopped asking when Daddy was coming home, the question having become too painful, too loaded with the unspoken. Instead, she retreated into her drawings, her usual vibrant colors muted, her fantastical winged beasts now looking more mournful than majestic, their eyes large and sad. She would sit for hours by the window in her bedroom, a silent vigil, watching the street, as if Arthur might simply walk back into their lives, his shadow lengthening in the afternoon sun. Eleanor would watch her from the doorway, the sight of her daughter's silent vigil breaking her heart into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but the words seemed to catch in her throat, choked by her own grief and the fear of what she didn't know. The police offered no leads, no breakthroughs. Arthur Finch had simply vanished into the summer of 1978, leaving behind a gaping, echoing silence. The house, once filled with the low hum of Arthur's presence, the faint scent of pipe tobacco, the rhythmic tap-tap of his hammer from the shed, the murmur of his voice reading the newspaper, now felt vast and empty, a constant reminder of absence. The quiet was a physical thing, pressing in, making every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, seem unnaturally loud. To keep the bills paid, Eleanor was forced to sell some of Arthur's carpentry tools. The heavy, polished wood of his planes and chisels felt alien in her hands, cold and unresponsive without his touch. She took them to a small second-hand shop on the edge of town, the owner, a gruff man with grease under his fingernails, barely looking up as he offered a pittance. Each transaction was a small death, another piece of Arthur chipped away, replaced by the grim reality of survival. She left the shop with a handful of crumpled notes, the weight of the loss far heavier than the money in her purse. The autumn of 1978 brought a chill that seeped into the very bones of the Finch household. The leaves outside turned brittle and fell, mirroring the desolation within. Eleanor, with no choice but to push through her grief and confusion, took on 2 cleaning jobs. Her hands, once soft from years of homemaking, grew rough and red from harsh detergents, the skin cracked and sore. She scrubbed other people's floors, polished their furniture until it gleamed, a stark contrast to her own home, which now felt perpetually dusty. She returned home exhausted, the scent of lemon disinfectant clinging to her clothes, a constant reminder of her new, harsher reality. Sarah, meanwhile, started 4th grade. The empty chair at the breakfast table was a constant, unspoken presence, a silent accusation. Kids at school, with their brutal honesty, sometimes asked about her dad. "Where's your dad, Sarah?" a boy named Kevin asked one day, kicking at a loose stone. She'd offer the vague, rehearsed answer Eleanor had given her, "He's away on a long trip for work." But the look in her eyes, a flicker of pain and confusion, betrayed the truth. She often found solace in the school library, losing herself in stories of faraway lands and brave heroes, a quiet escape from the reality of her fractured home. The smell of old paper and forgotten adventures was a comfort, a temporary balm for her aching heart. One blustery Saturday, as the wind howled around the house, Eleanor's old Ford Cortina, a relic from better days, sputtered and died on the way to the grocery store. Smoke billowed from under the bonnet, a thick, acrid cloud that made her cough. Eleanor, tears of frustration stinging her eyes, stared at the lifeless engine, the dull thrum of her despair now punctuated by mechanical failure. It felt like another cruel blow, another symbol of their crumbling stability, as if the universe itself was conspiring against them. She leaned against the cold metal, a profound weariness settling over her. Mr. Henderson, Arthur's old boss, a kind but gruff man who occasionally checked in on them with a bag of groceries or a stern word of encouragement, came by later with his own tools. He spent hours hunched over the engine, his brow furrowed in concentration, the air filled with the clinking of wrenches and the occasional muttered curse. But it was beyond repair. "She's had it, Eleanor," he said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Engine seized. Could find you a cheaper, older replacement, maybe, but it'd still be a mountain." The cost was indeed a mountain, an insurmountable peak in their already strained finances. Eleanor ended up relying on buses, their unreliable schedules and crowded seats, and the kindness of Mrs. Gable next door, who, despite her gossipy tendencies, offered rides to the market. The loss of their car was a stark reminder of how quickly their world had shrunk, how isolated they had become. As 1979 bled into 1980, the initial shock began to settle into a dull, persistent ache. Eleanor found a full-time job at a local electronics factory, assembling circuit boards. The work was monotonous, the noise of the machines relentless, a constant, high-pitched whine that eventually numbed her senses. But the steady pay allowed them to keep their small house, to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She rarely spoke of Arthur now, burying her pain beneath a thick layer of practicality, focusing only on the next shift, the next bill. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would hear her mother crying softly in her bedroom, a muffled, heartbreaking sound that was far more devastating than any shouted argument. It was the sound of a grief that had no outlet, no resolution. Sarah, now 11, started to resent the silence, the unspoken questions that hung in the air like dust motes. She remembered her father's laughter, deep and rumbling, the way he'd let her help him in his shed, handing him tools, the rich smell of wood shavings and pipe tobacco filling the air. Those memories were precious, fragments of a happier time, but they also felt fragile, threatened by the growing years of absence, like old photographs fading in the sun. She clung to them, afraid they might disappear entirely. In the spring of 1982, A letter arrived, postmarked from a small town a few hundred miles north. The handwriting was unfamiliar, looping and feminine. Eleanor stared at it for a long moment, her heart leaping with a frantic, desperate hope she hadn't realized she still possessed. It was from a woman named Martha, who claimed Arthur had worked for her husband for a few weeks in late 1978, doing odd carpentry jobs. She'd seen his picture on an old missing persons flyer someone had left behind in their general store, tucked under a pile of newspapers. Eleanor called the number on the letter, her voice trembling as she introduced herself. Martha was kind, her voice soft and hesitant but vague. "Oh, Arthur. Yes, I remember him," she said slowly. "He was quiet, kept to himself. Good with his hands, your husband. But a bit troubled, I thought. Always looking over his shoulder, like he was expecting someone." She recalled he'd left abruptly one morning, just like he'd arrived, without a word, leaving behind only a few tools and an unpaid bill for a week's lodging. The lead, once so promising, dissolved into another dead end, leaving Eleanor with a fresh wave of disappointment and a renewed sense of Arthur's elusive nature. A man who seemed to slip through the world like smoke. Sarah, now 13, was becoming more aware of the world beyond their quiet street. A world full of questions and unspoken truths. She started picking through old photo albums, the thick pages smelling of dust and nostalgia, studying her father's face in the fading images. She tried to decipher the man in the photographs, searching for clues, for answers. She'd ask Eleanor direct questions, probing at the edges of her mother's carefully constructed silence. "Did he ever say he was unhappy, Mum?" she asked one evening, her voice quiet but insistent. "Did you two fight before he left?" Eleanor would offer clipped, evasive answers, her eyes growing distant, a wall rising between them. "No, Sarah. Not really. It was complicated." Sarah felt a growing frustration, a sense that a crucial piece of her own history was being withheld, locked away in her mother's grief. She started acting out a little, a clumsy, desperate attempt to feel something, anything, other than the quiet ache of her father's ghost. She skipped school a few times, hanging out with a rougher crowd from the edges of their suburb, kids who smoked behind the shops and talked with a bravado she didn't quite understand. It wasn't malice, not true rebellion, but a clumsy, desperate lashing out, a search for an emotion strong enough to cut through the years of silence. Eleanor would find out, of course, and there would be arguments, hushed and tense, each one widening the chasm between them. One afternoon in 1984, Sarah, homesick from school with a persistent cough, was rummaging through Arthur's old shed. It was now a storage space for Eleanor's gardening tools and forgotten household items, smelling faintly of damp earth and rust. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light from the grimy window, illuminating the forgotten corners. Bored and restless, she climbed onto a rickety stool, reaching for a dusty, rusty biscuit tin on a high shelf, beneath some old paint cans. It rattled as she pulled it down. Inside, nestled amongst dried-up brushes and a tangle of old string, she found a small, leather-bound journal. It was Arthur's. Her heart pounded, a sudden, fierce drumbeat in her chest. She opened it carefully, the worn leather creaking. Inside, the pages were filled with his neat, precise handwriting, not daily entries, but scattered thoughts, worries, and intricate sketches of furniture designs. The last entry, dated a week before he disappeared, spoke of a profound weariness, a feeling of being trapped in a life that isn't mine, of the walls closing in. He wrote of a longing for open spaces, for a different kind of freedom, a life unburdened by the constant struggle to provide. There was no mention of leaving his family, no blame directed at Eleanor or Sarah, just a deep, personal despair, a quiet confession of a soul suffocating under unspoken burdens. Sarah read it over and over, the words resonating with a sorrow she hadn't fully understood until then. It wasn't the dramatic explanation she might have hoped for, no grand betrayal or sudden tragedy, but it was a window into the man, a glimpse of the internal struggle that had led to his quiet exit. The journal fell open on her lap, and the shed, once just a dusty storage space, became a sacred, painful place of understanding. She closed the journal, the worn leather cool beneath her fingers, and a new, complex understanding settled in her chest, heavy and profound. The words Arthur had penned, raw and desperate, now resonated with a different kind of ache, not just for his pain, but for the ripple effect it had left behind. She pushed the book aside, the silence of the room suddenly vast. The mid-80s had brought a new, insidious wave of anxiety to their quiet town. Eleanor's factory, a sturdy brick edifice that had hummed with purpose for decades, began to falter, its rhythm growing erratic. Whispers of downsizing, of foreign competition, of entire production lines being shipped overseas, snaked through the community like a cold mist. The threat of losing her job, a stable anchor in their precarious world, hung heavy in the air for Eleanor, a familiar, suffocating echo of the financial anxieties that had plagued Arthur. Eleanor, now a seasoned survivor, faced it with a grim, almost defiant determination. Sarah watched her mother, saw the way her jaw tightened when she read the local paper, the way she massaged her temples after a long shift, the stress etching deeper, permanent lines onto her already tired face. Sarah, now 16, observed her mother's resilience with a quiet awe, but also the visible toll it took. The journal had irrevocably changed Sarah's perspective, peeling back layers of childish anger to reveal a more nuanced, heartbreaking truth. Her fury at her father had softened, replaced by a profound, complicated sadness. She understood now that he hadn't left them out of malice or abandonment, but had run from a part of himself, from a trap he felt closing in. This understanding, however, didn't lessen the profound impact of his absence on her own life, the quiet void that had shaped her adolescence. She often wondered if she carried some of his restless spirit, some of his quiet despair, a genetic echo she couldn't quite shake. The library became her sanctuary once more, but this time, it wasn't for the escapism of fiction. She spent long afternoons hunched over dusty microfiche readers, the hum of the machine a constant companion. She pored over old newspapers, her fingers stained with the faint scent of aged paper and ink, looking for any mention, any clue, however small, that might shed light on the fate of Arthur Finch. She found nothing new, no headline, no small column buried on an inside page. The search yielded no answers, but the act itself, the methodical turning of pages, the focused intent, felt like a vital connection, a way to keep his memory alive, and to process her own swirling, complex feelings. It was a silent conversation across years, a daughter reaching out into the void. The late spring of 1988 painted the world in vibrant greens and blues, a stark contrast to the muted tones that had often characterized the Finch household. The air, thick with the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass, felt full of possibility. Sarah, now 19, stood at the threshold of adulthood, the cusp of a future she had meticulously, quietly built. The thin envelope had arrived that morning, tucked amidst bills and junk mail. Inside, the crisp paper of an acceptance letter to university, a small scholarship tucked within its folds. It was a moment of triumph, hard-won, a testament to Eleanor's unwavering support and Sarah's own quiet, fierce resilience. But as she held the letter, the official seal cool against her palm, a familiar pang, a ghost of a question, stirred within her. She was about to embark on a new life, a grand adventure, but the unresolved chapter of her father's disappearance still lingered, a faint, unwritten postscript to her own story, a shadow at the edge of her bright future. That evening, the scent of roasting chicken casserole, Sarah's favorite, filled the small house. Eleanor moved about the kitchen with a rare lightness, the promise of celebration in her step. Sarah found her mother in the living room, a soft cloth in her hand, dusting the old mantelpiece. On it, usually bare save for a few ceramic birds, sat a single, framed photograph. It was a picture Sarah hadn't seen in years, one Eleanor rarely displayed, usually tucked away in a drawer in the dresser. In the photo, a smiling Arthur held a much younger Sarah on his shoulders, both laughing, their faces lit by sunshine, frozen in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Sarah picked it up, her thumb tracing the outline of her father's smiling face, the faded colors a testament to the passage of time. Eleanor turned from the mantelpiece, her eyes, usually guarded, softened as they fell upon her daughter and the photograph. "He would have been so proud of you, love," Eleanor said softly, her voice thick with an emotion Sarah hadn't heard from her in years. It was the most direct, unguarded reference to Arthur she had made in what felt like a lifetime. Sarah looked at her mother then, truly looked at her, not just at the familiar shape of her, but into the depths of her eyes. She saw the strength that had carried them, the deep lines of worry and hard work etched around her mouth, but beneath it all, a profound, enduring love that had been their bedrock. "Mum," Sarah began, her voice tentative, a fragile whisper breaking the quiet hum of the house, did you ever stop looking?" Eleanor sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of years of unspoken pain, of lonely nights and unanswered questions. She moved to the sofa, her movements slow, deliberate, and sat down, patting the cushion beside her. Sarah sat, the old springs groaning softly beneath them. "I never stop looking in my heart, Sarah." "Not really," Eleanor began, her gaze fixed on a distant point on the wall, as if seeing ghosts there. "But there comes a point when you have to choose to live. For you. For us. The police, they stopped years ago. There was nothing to find. No body, no trail, no new leads. Just nothing." Her voice cracked on the last word, a raw edge of grief she rarely allowed to surface. "And after a while, every phone call, every rumor, every flicker of hope, it just hurt more than it helped. I had to build a life for us, love. A new one. I had to." "But you still wonder," Sarah pressed gently, her voice barely a whisper, needing to hear it, to share the burden. Eleanor finally met her gaze, her eyes glistening, a single tear escaping to trace a path down her cheek. "Every single day. What happened to him? Was he all right? Did he find what he was looking for? Did he ever think of us?" She paused, her breath catching. "But I also learned that some questions don't have answers. And sometimes, living means accepting that. It doesn't mean forgetting him, not ever. It just means finding a way to carry the question, without letting it crush you." Her hand reached out, finding Sarah's, squeezing it gently. Sarah nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of the immense weight her mother had carried alone for so long. She thought of Arthur's journal, the words about feeling trapped, about seeking freedom from a life that felt too small. She understood a little more now, not just her father's pain, but her mother's impossible choice, the terrible calculus of love and survival. Eleanor had to choose between endless, fruitless grief, a life consumed by a phantom, and building a future, however fragile, for the child who remained. The next morning, the air was crisp and cool, carrying the promise of a warm spring day. Before leaving for the train station to visit a university open day, a journey that felt like the first step into her unknown future, Sarah walked alone to Arthur's old shed. It stood a little crooked now, nestled amongst overgrown bushes, still filled with the faint scent of damp earth and old wood, a ghost of his presence. She unlatched the door, the hinges groaning, and stepped inside. From the high shelf, tucked behind a stack of terracotta pots, she took out the biscuit tin, retrieving the leather journal. She didn't open it. The words were etched into her memory now, a part of her own story. Instead, she walked to the small, overgrown patch behind the shed where Arthur used to grow his prize-winning roses. A patch now wild with weeds and brambles, the memory of cultivation long lost. She knelt, the damp earth cool against her knees, and dug a small hole with her bare hands, the soil crumbling easily. She placed the journal inside, a quiet, reverent act, covering it gently with earth, smoothing it over. It wasn't an act of forgetting, but an act of placing his story, his unresolved quest, his quiet despair, back into the earth, back into the past, where it belonged, rooted yet released. It was a way of honoring his struggle, while simultaneously freeing herself to forge her own path, unburdened by the need to solve an unsolvable mystery. As she stood up, dusting the soil from her hands, A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree that towered over the shed, a deep, sighing sound. The sun broke through a gap in the clouds, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of light and shadow, illuminating the small, disturbed patch of earth. Sarah took a deep breath, the air fresh and clean, carrying the scent of damp soil and new spring growth. She didn't have the answers she once craved, the clear-cut resolutions that stories promised, but she had something else. A quiet understanding, a profound empathy that stretched across the years, and the strength to step into her future, not defined by an absence, but shaped by the love and resilience that had carried her through. She walked out of the garden, leaving the past buried, a secret held by the earth and the whispering oak. At the kitchen door, Eleanor was waiting, a small, knowing smile on her lips, a thermos of tea and a packed lunch on the table. She simply nodded, a shared glance passing between them that spoke volumes. Sarah picked up her bag, a lightness in her step she hadn't felt in years. She headed towards the open road, towards the station, towards a new beginning, the lingering warmth of her mother's gaze a silent blessing at her back. The road stretched out before her, long and bright, an invitation. If this story left any impression on you, or reminded you of a moment from your own life, feel free to share it in the comments. Even a small memory is enough. Stories from the past often carry meaning we only begin to understand much later. Your memory might become part of someone else's story.